February 8, 1968, Orangeburg, South Carolina. Cold night air wrapped around a black college campus. They were cold, but they were not leaving. They were tired, but they were not backing down. They had tried for days to desegregate a bowling alley in town. A simple bowling alley that still refused to serve black students years after the Civil Rights Act. That was the spark. But by this moment, it was about more than bowling. It was about dignity. Then it happened. A sound cut through the singing, a loud crack, a shot. For a split second, no one moved. The human brain wants to believe it misheard. Maybe it was something else. Maybe it was a warning shot. Maybe they would stop there. They did not stop. In the next 8 to 10 seconds, multiple shotguns opened fire into that crowd of unarmed black students. Buckshot tore through the night. Pellets ripped into backs, arms, legs, and feet as young people turned and ran for their lives. For those few seconds, that campus field became a killing ground. When the smoke cleared, 3 young men lay dying. Around 28 more lay bleeding, screaming, or unable to stand. Most of the bullets hit students who were running away, in the back, through the soles of their feet. They were fleeing shotgun blasts from officers of their own state, not from some foreign army, from the people paid to protect them. Think about that. Students on a black college campus praying, singing, protesting a segregated bowling alley, shot in the back by state troopers in less than 10 seconds. And then, as if the gunfire was not enough, something else just as deadly began. A wave of lies so powerful that for decades, most of this country never even knew this massacre had happened. You probably grew up hearing about Kent State. 4 white students killed by the National Guard in Ohio in May of 1970. Maybe you saw the pictures. Maybe you heard the song Ohio on the radio. Maybe you watched documentaries or saw it in your school textbooks. But this happened first, 2 years earlier, in South Carolina, to black students on February 8, 1968. And for most of America, it might as well have never happened at all. So here is the hard question. How does a state trooper massacre of black students at a prayer vigil disappear from the national story for half a century? Floodlights glared across the field in front of South Carolina State. A crowd of young students stood together near a bonfire singing old spirituals and freedom songs. How do 3 dead, 28 wounded, and 31 lives scarred by shotgun blasts get pushed under the rug so deep that even people who lived through the civil rights era never heard their names? You are about to find out. Today, we are going to walk back into that night in Orangeburg. We are going to listen to the voices they tried to silence. We are going to name the names they tried to bury. And we are going to connect what happened on that field to what you see on your screen today when yet another video surfaces of yet another black person killed by police. This is not just about history. This is about inheritance. This is about the stories that were stolen from you, right along with land, wealth, and opportunity. This is about the blood price your ancestors paid, while textbooks fed you a watered-down fairy tale. You have been told a very careful version of American history. You know the official hits. Rosa Parks on the bus, Martin Luther King at the Lincoln Memorial, maybe Malcolm in a soundbite, maybe Selma in a movie. But the pattern underneath the hidden record of what really happened to black communities when they dared to demand full humanity, that part was edited out, scrubbed, sanitized. That ends today. By the time you reach the end of this journey, you will know exactly what happened at Orangeburg on February 8, 1968. You will understand who fired the shots and who paid the price. You will see how local government, state leaders, federal agencies, and national media work together, whether on purpose or through cowardice, to twist the story into something it was not. You will see how the only person who went to prison after this massacre was not one of the officers who pulled the trigger, but a black civil rights organizer who never fired a single shot. After this video, you will understand why police violence against black people keeps repeating. You will understand why a teenager like Trayvon Martin, a man like Michael Brown or George Floyd, or a woman like Breonna Taylor can die at the hands of law enforcement or under the shadow of the badge, and the system still finds a way to let those responsible walk free. You will see that this is not a glitch, it is a pattern. You will also see something else. You will see the courage of young black students who dared to stand up in a small southern town when they knew the state troopers were already on edge. You will see the faith of young people who still sang, still prayed, still showed up night after night, even after their friends were arrested, even after the threats came. And you will see how that courage lives in you right now, whether you knew this story or not. This is not about making you hate anybody. This is not about drawing a line between black and white and saying that is the whole story. This is about truth versus lies, justice versus oppression. This is about tearing down the false comfort that comes from thinking that violence like this is ancient rare or disconnected from the present. It is not. If you have ever felt like something about the official version of history did not add up, you are not crazy. If you ever felt that your grandparents knew more than the textbooks, you are right. In the black church, in family kitchens, in late-night conversations after Sunday service, people have whispered the parts that were never written down. This is one of those parts, so here is the promise. By the end of this video, you will know the names Samuel Hammond, Henry Smith, and Delano Middleton, as well as, Kent State. You will understand why these young men died, how the system escaped accountability, and how the same logic that killed them lives on in policies, politics, policing, and education today. You will not look at the words riot or law and order the same way again. This is your history. This is your inheritance. And the fact that you are hearing it now is not an accident. You did not click on this by chance. God has a way of bringing buried truth to the surface at the exact moment it needs to be seen. You are here for a reason. But before we talk about the shots fired that night, you need to understand why those students were on that field in the first place. Because this did not start with a bonfire. It started with a bowling alley. Orangeburg, South Carolina, in the late 1960s, looked like 100 other small southern towns on the surface. 2-lane roads, church steeples, houses with front porches. But it had something many towns did not. It had not one, but 2 historically black colleges sitting almost side by side. South Carolina State College, now South Carolina State University, and Claflin College, now Claflin University. These schools were more than campuses. They were power centers in a state that had no desire to see black power grow. Students at these schools lived with Jim Crow baked into every part of daily life. Yes, the Civil Rights Act had passed in 1964. On paper, segregation in public accommodations was over. In reality, local businesses, police, and officials treated that law like a suggestion they never planned to follow. Black students could not just walk into any restaurant they wanted. They knew which streets to avoid at night. They knew which stores would serve them, and which would pretend not to see them. And then there was the bowling alley. All-Star Bowling Lanes sat on Russell Street, not far from the campus. It was the only bowling alley in town. For years, black students drove past it, watched white people go in and out, and knew the door was not open to them. Even after federal law said it should be. The owner, a white man named Harry Floyd, insisted his business was private. Federal law said one thing. Floyd said another. And in Orangeburg, the local power structure backed him. not the law. That is how white supremacy works when it feels at home. It treats federal law as decoration. By early 1968, young people at South Carolina State and Claflin were done waiting for polite change. They had grown up hearing about sit-ins in Greensboro. They had seen what happened in Birmingham. They had watched black people in cities across the South risk their lives at lunch counters, on buses, and at ballot boxes. Many of their parents had survived the worst days of lynching and open terror. Now this new generation had campuses, books, professors, and a sense of time running short. The country was talking about Vietnam, about riots in northern cities, about black power. And here in Orangeburg, they still could not bowl in their own town. So on February 6, 1968, about 200 black students walked down to All-Star bowling lanes. No social media, no viral hashtags, just word-of-mouth handwritten flyers and the network that has always powered black resistance. The church, the campus, and the street. They walked to the door and asked to be served. The door was locked. Some tried to push in. Police were called. Students chanted, prayed, and refused to leave. There was pushing, shoving, tension rising. Some windows were broken. Glass on the sidewalk. No guns. No firebombs. Just the kind of unrest that always happens when people who have been told no their whole lives finally decide to say yes to themselves. The next night, February 7th, students came back. Again, they tried to push the issue. Again, police met them. This time, 15 students were arrested, handcuffed, taken away, for daring to test a door in their own town that should have been open. Word spread fast on campus. Anger rose with every new story of rough handling, insults, and threats from officers. And something else happened. State officials decided this small-town protest was not small anymore. They decided to make an example. The state sent in highway patrol officers and other law enforcement units. They set up barricades near the campus. Some students started calling one intersection checkpoint Charlie, echoing the Berlin Wall. Imagine that. A southern town so controlled that a simple road leading to a black college felt like an occupied zone. And in the middle of all this stood a man named Cleveland Sellers. Cleveland Sellers was a seasoned organizer connected to the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He was no outsider tourist in the struggle. He was born in Denmark, South Carolina, just up the road. He had been in the movement for years, working, training, and taking risks long before cameras showed up. He understood both the power of student energy and the danger that came when power felt threatened by that energy. Sellers did not bring guns. He brought strategy. He helped students organize, clarify demands, and think about nonviolent protest in a town where the line between peace and bloodshed was razor thin. That alone made him a problem in the eyes of the state. Some were holding hands. Some were bowing their heads in prayer. Some were just watching, wondering how far the state would go to stop them this time. A confident, educated black man with organizing skills is one of the things white supremacist systems fear the most. By the time February 8th came, you had hundreds of students on edge after 2 nights of confrontation and arrests. You had state troopers with shotguns, some of whom had been stewing in resentment, racism, and fear their whole careers. You had a governor worried about his image, terrified of being seen as weak and eager to paint any challenge as the work of dangerous radicals. You had national media barely paying attention, and when they did, their default assumption was that the authorities were telling the truth. It was a recipe for disaster. So when those students gathered that night near the front of the South Carolina State campus, around that fire singing and praying, they were not just protesting a bowling alley anymore. They were standing in the crosshairs of a system that had always relied on violence to keep black people in their place. Most of them did not know how close to death they were. You already know what happened next. But you do not yet know who those 3 who died really were. A massacre can swallow names. It can turn individuals into numbers. 3 dead, 28 wounded, 31 shot. That is how newspapers like to tell it. Clean, detached. But these were not numbers. These were sons, classmates, friends, future husbands, future fathers, future leaders. So before we talk about the gunfire, we need to talk about them. Picture Samuel Hammond, 18 years old, a freshman at South Carolina State. He came from Florida to Orangeburg for one reason: education. He believed in the promise that if he studied hard, followed the rules, got that degree, he could build a better life. He was not some wild radical pulled into something he did not understand. He was a young man walking the path America said was the way out. Books, campus, diploma. Now picture Henry Smith, also 18, a sophomore, from Marion, South Carolina. He was a year ahead. He knew the campus routines, knew which professors to avoid, which ones to trust, which dining hall line moved faster. He had already lived through the first terrifying months away from home and had started to see college as his world. Then there was Delano Middleton, 17, a senior at Wilkinson High School right there in Orangeburg. He did not even attend South Carolina State. That night he went to the campus like any teenager would. Maybe he wanted to see what the older students were doing. Maybe he had friends there. Maybe he just felt drawn to the energy, the singing, the sense that something important was happening. He was not on any protest roster. He was not a speaker. He was a kid who loved basketball, who had a mother who worked at the college, who had a whole lifetime ahead of him. Think about your own life at those ages. Think about being 18 and stepping onto a college campus, feeling that mix of fear and excitement. Think about being 17 and curious about everything. Now imagine that one decision to stand in the wrong place at the wrong time costs you everything. Not because you robbed a store, not because you pulled a knife, but because you were black and alive, in a place that had decided your existence was a threat. When the troopers opened fire, these 3 young men were not charging forward with weapons. They were running away. Witnesses have said again and again that students were shot in the back, in the feet, in the legs, as they tried to escape. Pellets tore into flesh, meant to walk across stages and into futures. Samuel went down. Henry went down. Delano was hit over and over, one shot after another, tearing into his body until there was nothing left to save. You will hear numbers like 7 wounds in Delano, shots through arms, hip, thigh, chest. You will hear that Henry had multiple wounds hit from more than one direction. You will hear that Samuel, too, took pellets that ended his life. But do not let the numbers numb you. Visualize the field. Hear the screams. Feel the panic of young people realizing that the men with guns were not firing warning shots. They were firing to kill. The state later liked to talk about officers firing in fear, about confusion, about chaos. But the patterns of the wounds tell a different story. Backs, feet. If you are shooting in self-defense, the people you shoot are usually coming toward you. If you are shooting people in the back, they are running away. That is not defense. That is punishment. So how did the story become something else? How did this massacre become a riot in the public record? How did the killers walk free while a black organizer went to prison? How did the names of Samuel Henry and Delano fade from memory while the lie about what happened stayed printed and reprinted? Most people never heard what came out of the official mouths in the hours and days after those shots. They heard the gunfire on campus. They saw the bodies. They watched ambulances race away. But once the state started talking, the story twisted fast. Right after the shooting, South Carolina's Governor Robert McNair stepped up to microphones and told the world something simple and very powerful. He said there had been a riot in Orangeburg. He said dangerous agitators had come in from outside. He said the students had basically started a war with law enforcement. He painted a picture of officers under attack, forced to fire back. You already know why that matters. Most people in this country will never visit a crime scene. They will never talk to survivors. They only hear what officials tell them through the news. So when a governor calls it a riot and hints that black students with guns were shooting at officers, most of the country shrugs and moves on. Another riot, another group of radicals. Nothing to see here. The Associated Press ran an early story with language that talked about an exchange of gunfire. An exchange. That word does a lot of work. It makes it sound like two sides shooting at each other. Officers shooting back at students. When that idea gets into headlines, it shapes everything. It tilts sympathy away from the dead and toward the people with badges. But listen to the people who were there on the ground. Students who survived have said for decades that no one on their side had guns. Journalists who were present, including at least one from the national press, have admitted that they heard no gunfire coming from the students. The wounds in the bodies, the pellets in backs and feet, all shout the same thing. The shooting went one way, yet the lie stayed in the air. Law enforcement leaned into that narrative hard. They said an officer had been hit earlier by a wooden banister thrown from a dorm. They used that injury as proof that the students were dangerous and violent. Think about that equation. A piece of wood thrown from a building versus a line of state troopers with shotguns. One officer injured versus 3 young men dead and dozens wounded. But in the story, they told the students were the aggressors and the officers were simply trying to survive. They also used the favorite tool of every Southern politician afraid of change in that era, the outside agitator myth. They pointed to Cleveland Sellers and people like him as proof that troublemakers from outside the community had come in to stir up the youth. As if black students at a black college in a Jim Crow town needed anyone from outside to tell them that being barred from a bowling alley was wrong. You know why that myth is so powerful. If you can convince the public that locals are mostly happy and only a few outsiders are causing trouble, then you do not have to face the real issue. You do not have to admit that ordinary black people are sick of being pushed down. You can keep pretending that the problem is not the system. The problem is radicals. So in the days after the massacre, the official script locked in. Rioting students, outside agitators, law enforcement under attack, officers forced to fire. The governor called it one of the saddest events in the state's history, but he did not stand beside grieving black families and call their children victims of state violence. He stood beside law enforcement and treated them like the wounded party. Now you might think that once the smoke cleared and the facts came out, the courts would straighten this out. Surely someone would be held accountable for killing unarmed students on a college campus. Surely the legal system would step in where politics had failed. That is what you were taught, right? That the courts are the last line of defense. This next truth will shatter that illusion. The federal government did notice what happened. The United States Attorney General at the time, Ramsey Clark, was not blind. He sent investigators. He looked at the facts. He saw the pattern of wounds. He listened to witnesses who said officers fired on students who had no guns. He came to a conclusion that many white politicians in South Carolina did not want to hear. The problem that night was not a mob of armed black students. The problem was criminal acts by police. Ramsey Clark pushed for legal action. A federal grand jury indicted 9 white highway patrolmen on charges that they had violated the civil rights of the students by using deadly force. For a moment, it looked like there might be a real reckoning. Imagine being a black student on that campus and hearing that 9 officers had actually been charged. You might have thought the system was finally going to work. Then the trial began. It took place in South Carolina in front of a jury that did not look like the students who had been shot. The officers sat at the defense table, not in their uniforms, but in suits as if they were ordinary citizens caught up in a misunderstanding. Their lawyers painted them as men under siege, confused in a chaotic situation, doing their best to protect themselves. They questioned student witnesses, hard trying to poke holes in their stories. They leaned on that early narrative from the governor and the media. They repeated the same words: riot, outside agitators, fear, self-defense. Remember, this was less than 4 years after the Civil Rights Act. White resistance to change was still strong. Many white Southerners saw every protest as a threat to their way of life. When you put officers accused of firing on black students in front of a jury steeped in that mindset, what do you think happens? The verdict came back. All 9 officers not guilty. Not one conviction. Not 1 day in prison for any man who fired a weapon into that crowd. The state of South Carolina had already refused to charge them under state law. Now a federal jury had cleared them too. Legally, they walked away clean. Think about the message that sends to black students, to police, to the whole country. The message is simple. The state can shoot you in the back, then the state can judge itself and find itself innocent. And it got worse. While 9 white officers walked out of that courthouse, 3 men, a black activist named Cleveland Sellers, faced his own trial. The state charged him with inciting a riot related to the protests at the bowling alley. They did not accuse him of firing a gun. They did not accuse him of assault. They accused him of being the spark. At his trial, white law enforcement officers took the stand and testified against him. One officer claimed he had seen Sellers standing on top of a fire truck days earlier shouting "Burn, baby, burn." Sellers has said clearly that this was a lie. But in that courtroom, his word stood against a line of white officers in uniform and suits. The result: Cleveland Sellers was convicted. He was sentenced to prison on a charge that basically declared him a one-man riot. You hear the crackle of the fire. You hear a soft chorus of "We shall overcome drift through the darkness." He served months behind bars for his role in the protests, while the men whose shotguns tore through the bodies of students never spent a day in a cell for what they did that night. Years later, Ramsey Clark spoke openly about what happened in Orangeburg. He said plainly that those officers committed murder, not by accident, not in a haze where no one knew what was happening. He called it what it was. And yet the legal system had already stamped the case closed with a not guilty verdict. Decades passed. Sellers carried that felony on his record for almost 25 years. It affected his life, his work, his freedom to move through this country. Finally, in the early 1990s, long after the headlines had faded, the state of South Carolina granted him a pardon. They quietly erased the conviction that they had loudly used to blame him for the violence. But the officers who fired the shots never needed a pardon. They had never been found guilty in the first place. This is what systemic injustice looks like. It is not just a dirty cop losing his temper. It is a governor shaping a story. It is national media reinforcing that story. It is local prosecutors refusing to act. It is a grand jury declining to indict. It is a trial where a certain kind of defendant almost always gets the benefit of the doubt. It is an activist going to jail for being there, while armed officers walk free after pulling the trigger. Now ask yourself something. If you did not grow up hearing the names Samuel Hammond, Henry Smith, and Delano Middleton, but you did grow up hearing about Kent State, why is that? If you heard about Jackson State only in passing, or maybe not at all, why is that? If you knew nothing about Orangeburg until now, why is that? That is not an accident. That is not a simple oversight. That is part of a pattern, just as deliberate as the legal moves after the shooting. When a system wants to maintain its image, it does not just win in court. It also wins in the classroom, in the newsroom, in the archives. It decides what becomes common knowledge and what becomes a footnote no one reads. Orangeburg did not vanish by mistake. It was buried. In the years after 1968, South Carolina did not launch a sweeping state-level investigation into the massacre. There was no truth commission, no criminal reopenings, no broad public hearings where survivors and families could speak and have their words recorded in the official record. For a long time, there was mostly silence. History classes in the state barely mentioned what happened, if they mentioned it at all. Generations of students grew up in the very same towns and counties, drove past the same roads, maybe even had relatives who had been there that night, and never heard a word in school about state troopers killing 3 black students at a local college. Think about that. Imagine living in a place where a massacre happened, but the official state curriculum never teaches you that it exists. You learn about Lexington and Concord. You learn about Pearl Harbor. You may even learn about Selma. But Orangeburg? Nothing. The way officials described the event helped with the burial. They called it the Orangeburg riot, not the Orangeburg massacre. Riot sounds chaotic. Riot sounds like shared blame. Riot sounds like something where if people had just stayed home, nothing bad would have happened. Riot puts the weight on the crowd, not on the men who fired the weapons. Massacre, on the other hand, is a word reserved for things the system wants you to feel horror about. Wounded Knee. My Lie. Kent State eventually started to be framed that way. But for decades, Orangeburg stayed officially a riot. That single word helped keep it in the shadows. It took more than 30 years before a South Carolina governor publicly referred to what happened as the Orangeburg Massacre. By then, many of the parents of those students were gone. Many of the officers were gone or retired. The families had carried their grief and anger through funerals, birthdays, graduations that never happened. Empty chairs at Thanksgiving, all without the state owning what it had done. On the ground at South Carolina, state things were different. The school, the families, the local black community never forgot. Every year, people gathered to remember the dead. Names were spoken in prayer, in sermons, in student meetings. Memorials on campus kept quiet, but powerful watch. But that local memory lived like a candle in a locked room, while the wider world stayed in the dark. The physical landscape also tells its own story. The All-Star bowling lanes eventually closed. The building sits there in Orangeburg abandoned. It is a shell. No neon sign inviting bowlers. No sound of pins crashing. Just a structure that once sparked a confrontation that led step by step to blood on a campus field. For a long time, no major historical marker outside that building told passing drivers what once unfolded because of one man's refusal to let black students bowl. So you have an abandoned bowling alley where the story began, a campus that remembers a state government that took decades to even half acknowledge the truth, and a national narrative that almost completely left this out. That is what erasure looks like in real life. Not just a missing paragraph in a textbook, a whole chain of silence that turns murder into rumor. Why does that matter now? Because the same forces that buried Orangeburg are at work today. When you watch footage of a police killing on your phone, pay attention to how quickly the narrative machine starts moving. How fast does local law enforcement release a statement that tells their side? How fast do certain media outlets repeat those claims before all the facts are in? How fast do people start saying things like, "We do not know the whole story," or "He should have complied"? You saw it with Michael Brown in Ferguson. Before his body was even removed from the street, stories began to circulate that he had reached for the officer's gun, that he had charged like a demon. You saw it with George Floyd. At first, officials tried to say he had some kind of medical incident, as if a knee on his neck for over 9 minutes was just a side factor. You saw it with Breonna Taylor. The initial story framed the raid as clean and justified, suggested that she and her boyfriend were connected to drugs in a way that turned her into a suspect rather than a victim. In each of those cases, as more evidence came out, the official version cracked. But notice something. Even when video witnesses and experts expose the lies, the system rarely convicts the people responsible at a level that matches the crime. Officers resign, they get reassigned. Maybe 1 or 2 face charges. Juries hesitate. Legal technicalities stand in the way. That is not new. Orangeburg shows you that the template was already there in 1968. Shoot. Lie. Blame the victims. Acquit the officers. Punish the activist. Bury the story. And just like Orangeburg was buried for decades, there are things happening right now that are being buried in real time. Incidents in small towns without cameras. Cases in cities where no one records. Stories that live only in the memories of families and neighbors until someone decides to dig them up. So when you hear that there is a huge wealth gap between black and white families in this country, when you hear numbers about how the median white household has many times the wealth of the median, black household do not accept the lie that this gap is about work ethic or culture. Think about what it means for the state to be able to kill black students without accountability and then erase that fact from public memory for half a century. If a system can do that to life and truth, what do you think it can do to land property insurance claims and opportunity? But before we talk about wealth reparations and the massive economic theft behind stories like this, you need to see something else. You need to see that Orangeburg was not some rare, isolated tragedy. It was part of a pattern of state violence against black students and black communities whenever they stepped out of the script. A pattern that stretches from the end of slavery to right now. And what happened next in other towns on other campuses proves they knew exactly how to use that pattern to keep control. There is a pattern in America that shows up every time black students and black communities step out of line in the eyes of the system. You saw it at Orangeburg. You saw it again just 2 years later in Jackson, Mississippi. And when you place these events side by side, you start to see something that is bigger than any single town or single night. Picture another campus in the South. May 1970. Jackson State College in Mississippi. Students gathered near a dormitory. Tension in the air, but no army, no weapons, no organized militia. Police moved in. They claimed they felt threatened. They claimed they saw a gun. They opened fire on a building where black students lived and studied. When it was over, 2 young men were dead, at least a dozen wounded. Once again, nearly all the bullets flowed one way. Once again, there were no serious consequences for the officers who fired. Now put that next to Kent State in Ohio, which happened also in May of 1970. There, the National Guard fired into a crowd of mostly white students protesting the Vietnam War. 4 students died. Pictures from that day went around the world. A young woman kneeling by a body, screaming to the sky. That image seared itself into the conscience of the nation. Songs were written, books were published, movies were made, presidents were questioned. The event entered the official story stamped as a tragedy America must never forget. Think about the difference in reaction. At Orangeburg, 3 black students killed, 31 people shot. At Jackson State, 2 black students killed, more wounded. At Kent State, 4 white students killed. In one case after another, the pattern of force looks similar. State power meets student protest with guns. But which ones became national grief and which ones slipped into the margins? That difference is not about numbers. It is not about severity. It is about whose lives the system counts as central to the story it wants to tell about itself. It is one thing to admit that white students protesting a foreign war can be victims of state violence. It is another thing to admit that black students protesting racism at home have been targets again and again. You can go back further and see this logic in other forms. Look at how black veterans were treated when they came home from World War I and World War II. In city after city, the uniforms they wore made white supremacists nervous. Because a black man trained in combat, who had seen Europe, who knew there were other ways of being, was a man less likely to quietly accept Jim Crow at home. So violence followed them. Riots in the 19-teens and 20s, attacks on prosperous black neighborhoods. Throughout all of this, the same story popped up. Law and order, outside agitators, riot language to cover state and mob violence. When you understand that pattern, Orangeburg stops looking like a bizarre one-time outburst. It looks like a southern version of something that happens wherever black people push against the line that has been drawn around them. You can see it later in police attacks on protests in Birmingham, in Selma, in so many towns that never made the news beyond a short column on page 10. And it is not just about bullets. The pattern also shows up in how information and memory are controlled. The system does not only beat bodies, it also shapes minds. Think back to your own education. How many pages did you read about the American Revolution? How many weeks did you spend on the Civil War? Now, how many full days of class were devoted to studying the details of massacres against black communities after slavery? How much time did you spend on something like Wilmington in 1898, where white supremacists overthrew a local multiracial government and killed dozens of black people, then called it a riot by black men? How many pages did you read about Tulsa in 1921, where a prosperous black business district was bombed and burned to the ground, then called a Negro uprising for decades? If you got almost nothing on those events, you are not alone. That is the point. The education system reinforces a story where violence against black communities is either ignored, framed as justified, or softened until it feels like a regrettable misunderstanding rather than the deliberate destruction of people in power. Orangeburg fits right into that pattern. You see faces barely past childhood, lit by orange flames and the harsh white beams from police cars lined up on the road. State officials did not rush to put the truth into the curriculum. If anything, they did the opposite. They allowed a distorted version of events to calcify in the public record. The word riot stuck. The names of the dead did not. The trial and acquittal of the officers rarely appeared in textbooks. The conviction of Cleveland Sellers served as a quiet warning to anyone else who might think about organizing. Now, why does this matter to you if you are watching this decades later? Because the stories you are not taught shape your sense of what is normal. If you never hear how often the state has killed black people without consequence, you might look at each new incident and think maybe this time is an exception. Maybe this one is just a bad apple. Maybe this one is complicated. You do not see the long line behind it. Without that long line, you are more vulnerable to lies. When officials say a man who died with a knee on his neck simply had a heart problem, you might be tempted to give them the benefit of the doubt. When they say a woman shot in her own home was just collateral damage in a drug investigation, you might be tempted to see it as an unfortunate mistake. But once you know about Orangeburg, Jackson State, Tulsa, Wilmington, and so many other moments, you cannot unsee the pattern. This is not meant to make you hopeless. It is meant to make you clear-eyed, because clarity is the foundation for real change. So let us bring this closer to your life right now. Think about the economic side of this. Every time state violence or racist policy cuts down black lives, it does something else too. It wipes out potential. It wipes out careers. It wipes out wealth that those people would have built and passed on. Take the 3 young men at Orangeburg. If Samuel had lived, finished his degree, built a career, and started a family, he would have earned income over decades. He might have bought a home. He might have helped his children or grandchildren through school. He might have invested in a small business, a church, a community project. The same is true of Henry and Delano. Each of them represented a branch in a family tree that could have grown strong, stable, and prosperous over time. When you kill them at 17 and 18, you do not just end a life. You also erase everything that life would have produced. The lost earnings, the lost savings, the lost property, the lost leadership and guidance. Multiply that by every black life cut short by police or racial terror, and you start to see how the wealth gap is not some abstract statistic. It is a ledger soaked in blood. Even when lives are not taken, violence and injustice move money. When someone is injured and lives the rest of their life with trauma or disability that can limit their ability to work, earn, and save. When a family has to pour money into medical bills, court cases, or relocations to escape danger that drains resources that could have gone toward building something. And on top of that, consider how often systems blocked or reversed black progress, even when there was no headline making massacre. Redlining refused loans to black families in entire neighborhoods for decades. Urban renewal wiped out black business districts in city after city, using highways and demolition as tools. School policies and hiring discrimination kept black people out of higher-paying jobs or funneled them into underfunded schools. Each of those policies did what a shotgun blast does at a slower pace. It stole futures. So when you hear that the median white household holds many times the wealth of the median, black household do not picture 2 runners starting at the same line with one just running faster. Then picture another runner whose family tree has been cut down again and again, whose communities have been robbed or burned, whose ancestors were locked out of programs like the GI Bill or FHA-backed mortgages. Orangeburg sits inside that economic story, not outside it. The state did not only take lives that night, it took the wealth those lives would have created for black families. Now here is where the conversation gets even more uncomfortable for the system. If lives and wealth were stolen, then there is a debt. Not a metaphorical debt, a real debt, a moral debt, and in many cases a financial debt that could be calculated. People like to say that was long ago, let it go. They say slavery ended in 1865, as if everything wrong happened before the Civil War, and everything after that is just people complaining. But Orangeburg happened in 1968. That is not ancient history. If you are in your 50s today, you were either born or a small child when that happened. Your parents lived through it. Your grandparents definitely knew the climate that produced it. The families of those 3 slain students have never received meaningful justice or compensation. The officers who fired the shots never paid a legal price. The state that allowed it and then buried it never truly made amends. That is an unpaid bill. When people talk about reparations, the conversation often jumps straight to slavery. But there is another layer of reparations that is much closer in time. Reparations for specific documented acts of racial terror and state violence in the 20th century. Tulsa, Rosewood, Orangeburg, Jackson State. Cases where names, dates, locations, and damage are known. Imagine what it would mean for a state like South Carolina to officially investigate Orangeburg with full transparency. To name the officers who fired, to release all records, to hear sworn testimony from surviving students and families. to calculate the economic loss from the deaths and injuries, to apologize clearly and without qualification, to establish scholarships memorial funds, or direct payments to the descendants of those harmed. Some people would scream that this is reopening old wounds, but those wounds never closed. They were ignored. There is a difference. True healing requires truth and repair, not silence and time. This is not about revenge. This is not about punishing every white person alive for what some white officers did in 1968. This is about a system acknowledging what it did and making tangible moves to repair the damage. It is about saying your lives mattered, then even if we acted like they did not, and they matter now. If you are watching this and you are Black, this conversation might hit especially hard, because it is not theoretical for you. Your grandmother may have told you stories about living through segregation. Your grandfather may have told you what it felt like to know there were places in town he could not go. Your parents may have told you about being the first in their family to attend an integrated school or the only Black employee at their job. You know in your bones that history is not gone. It is sitting at the table with you every day. If you are watching this and you are not Black, this conversation is still yours, because you have also been shaped by what you were taught and what you were not taught. If you were raised to believe that the system basically works most of the time, and that any big failures are rare exceptions, then learning about Orangeburg and the pattern around it might feel like having the floor tilt under your feet. That is uncomfortable, but it is also necessary. If you were lied to about this, what else were you lied to about? You do not have to carry guilt for things you did not personally do, but you do have to decide what you will do with the truth now that you know it. Will you lean into it and ask, how can I support justice, repair, and honesty? Or will you turn away and say, that is sad, but it is not my problem? We are all standing in the shadow of choices made long before we were born. We did not choose those choices, but we are responsible for what we do now. So what do you do with all of this? What do you do with the anger that comes when you realize that your history was edited to protect the powerful? What do you do with the sorrow that rises when you picture those young men on that campus field? What do you do with the sense that something huge has been taken from you? Not just money, not just safety, but truth. Here is the first step. You refuse to let the story die again. If this truth is hitting you right now, if you are sitting there thinking, how did I never hear this? How did I go 50 years of life and never hear the names of these students? Then you know how powerful silence can be. You know how effective erasure has been. So pause for a moment. If this has opened your eyes, if you are feeling that mix of shock, anger, and clarity, go to the comments and write one word. Truth. That word says I see it now. That word says I refuse to go back to sleep on this. That word says this story matters. Hit the like button if you are done with the lies. Not because internet points are everything, but because platforms pay attention to what people react to. When you like and comment on history, they try to bury you, push it back into the light. Share this with someone who needs to wake up. A cousin who thinks they know all there is to know about the civil rights era. A church friend who is always talking about justice, but never heard about Orangeburg. A co-worker who says they want to learn more, but does not know where to start. Every share is an act of resistance. Every comment is a little marker in the digital record that says this happened. Every like is a small signal that Black lives, Black history, and Black truth matter to you. You are not just a viewer. You are a witness, and a witness has a responsibility. Now that you have seen how the state can use bullets, courts, and silence to steal lives and stories, you might be tempted to stop here, sit in sadness, and walk away. But there is more. Because Orangeburg is not only a story of injustice, It is also a story of survival, identity, and calling. You are not just the descendants of victims. You are the descendant of survivors, of warriors, of builders, of people who kept going when the state shot their children and called it law and order. And what you do with that identity from this moment on changes everything. You are not powerless. You are not small in this story. You are living proof that they failed. They tried to wipe out whole communities. They tried to erase entire movements. They tried to bury massacres like Orangeburg so deep that even the grandchildren would never find them. Yet here you are listening, learning, remembering. That alone is a miracle. Think about your own family for a moment. Think about your grandmother or great-grandmother. What did she have to face just to get through a day? Signs that said where she could and not go. White only counters, back doors, insults from the mouths of people she had to smile at to survive. She lived through systems designed to break her spirit. But she did not break. She raised children anyway. She cooked meals anyway. She sang in church anyway. She loved anyway. Think about your grandfather or great-grandfather. Maybe he fought in a war for a country that would not let him sit at a lunch counter in uniform. Maybe he worked himself to the bone in fields factories or shipyards, only to be paid less than white men doing the same job. Maybe he walked to vote under the glare of men who wanted him dead. But he kept walking. Those are not the stories of helpless victims. Those are the stories of warriors. You come from people who survived the Middle Passage, when millions were chained in the holds of ships, and many never saw land again. You come from people who survived slavery, where families were sold, apart beaten, and worked almost to death, yet still found ways to marry, to pray, to teach each other to read in secret. You come from people who survived lynching, chain gangs, convict leasing, and Jim Crow. You come from people who built communities, churches, and schools under constant threat. You are not here by accident. You are here because every generation before you refused to give up. That means your poverty, if you are struggling, is not a sign that you failed. It is evidence of how much has been taken. They stole land. They blocked loans. They underpaid your parents. They underfunded your schools. They locked your cousins up for things that others got a slap on the wrist for. They killed your leaders in the street and in the dark. If you are still here, still standing, still searching for truth, in spite of all of that, that is strength. You are not poor by nature. You are robbed. The system wants you to look at your bank account and blame yourself. It wants you to look at your neighborhood and blame your neighbors. It wants you to look at your history and see only suffering and defeat. Because a people who believe they are weak will not demand what is owed. A people who think their ancestors were nothing but slaves will not see themselves as heirs to stolen empires. So let this sink in. Your ancestors built wealth in places like Greenwood in Tulsa. They owned homes, businesses, hotels, theaters, newspapers. That wealth did not vanish because they were lazy. It was burned, bombed, and taken. Your ancestors built political power in places like Wilmington. They held office. They voted in large numbers. That power did not fade because they got tired. It was overthrown and shot down. Your ancestors sent their children to South Carolina State, Jackson State, and dozens of other schools to get degrees so they could step into professions, lead churches, run companies, and change the world. State troopers stood in a row, helmets on shotguns in their hands, eyes fixed on these students who only wanted one simple thing: to be treated like human beings in their own town. When the state sent troopers and police to fire on those students, it was trying to sever the line between past and future. It was trying to stop that growth. It did not stop it. It slowed it. It scarred it. But you are proof that it did not stop. So when you look in the mirror, do not see a random individual trying to fake it through life. See a living continuation of a story that refused to end. See the grandson of a woman who prayed you into existence. See the granddaughter of a man who walked to work in worn shoes so you could have options. See a survivor of a quiet war that has been waged on your people for centuries. You are not a mistake. You are a survivor of genocide. You are a descendant of warriors. You are an heir to stolen wealth, stolen land, and stolen opportunities. And yes, you are responsible for what you do with that. This is where faith comes in. Because if you think about everything your ancestors went through, and you still woke up this morning, you have to ask a question. Why? Why did God allow your bloodline to make it through slave ships, where people died by the thousands? Why did God allow your bloodline to make it through plantations where black bodies were worked to death? Why did God allow your bloodline to make it through lynching seasons, race riots, and mass incarceration? Why did God allow you personally to make it through car stops that could have gone wrong, hospitals that did not care, schools that tried to crush your confidence? There has to be a reason. In the Black church, there has always been an understanding that survival is not random. It is a calling. When you stand in a sanctuary and hear an elder say, "I should have been dead, but God kept me," that is not just a testimony about one person's luck. That is a statement about purpose. So hear this. God preserved you through all of this for a reason. Not just so you can grind on a job you hate until you retire and then die. Not just so you can watch television, scroll on a phone, and pass the time. You are here in this moment, hearing truths that your grandparents were denied, because God is waking something up in you. Part of that calling is to reveal truth. You cannot heal what you refuse to see. You cannot fix what you will not name. When you learn about Orangeburg, you are not just collecting trivia. You are reclaiming a stolen chapter of your story. When you tell your children about it, you are undoing a piece of the erasure. When you correct someone who repeats the old lies, you are standing in the gap between deception and reality. Another part of your calling is to demand justice, not just in some vague, symbolic way, in specific ways, for specific wrongs. That might mean supporting efforts to push states to investigate past massacres and admit what they did. That might mean backing policies that aim to close the wealth gap, not with empty slogans, but with serious investments and reparations. That might mean standing with families now who are fighting cases where their loved ones were killed by police. Demanding justice does not mean you hate anyone. It means you love what is right more than you love your own comfort. It means you refuse to accept a peace built on lies. A third part of your calling is to reclaim what was stolen to the degree that you can in your lifetime. You might not be able to personally collect every dollar that should be in Black hands, but you can build. You can support Black-owned businesses. You can buy land when possible. You can encourage your children and grandchildren to get education without losing themselves. You can pour into churches and community organizations that do real work, not just put on a show. Every time you build something that lasts, you are answering the massacre with life. Every time you invest in a child, teach a skill, or mentor someone, you are doing the opposite of what the system tried to do at Orangeburg. They tried to cut off future branches. You are helping new branches grow. So do not tell yourself you are powerless, because you are not a politician or a millionaire. That is a lie. You have power with your voice, your wallet, your vote, your relationships, and your prayers. And right now, you also have power with this screen. If you have made it this far, if you are still here listening to this, then you are part of a remnant that refuses to let truth die. This is not light entertainment. This is heavy. It takes strength to stay this long with something like this. So let that strength move you. Take a breath with me. You have just walked through a story they never meant for you to know. You have seen the faces of Samuel Henry and Delano. You have watched the troopers raise their guns in your mind. You have sat in the courtroom where officers walked free and an organizer went to prison. You have walked past an abandoned bowling alley and a quiet campus memorial. You have looked at the wealth gap with different eyes. Now do something with it. If this truth hit you deep, if you feel like something in you just snapped into focus, do not keep that to yourself. You are part of this now. Subscribe to this channel, not because the algorithm needs more numbers, but because there are hundreds more stories like this that have been buried. Orangeburg was not the only massacre. Maybe your own hometown has a forgotten story. Maybe your own family has a piece of history that never made the news. This space exists to drag those stories into the light with respect, detail, and love. Turn on notifications so you do not miss what comes next. Because every new story you learn fills in another missing piece of the puzzle. Every missing piece you find makes it harder for systems to gaslight you in the future. Tell your children this story. Do not wait for school. Do not assume their teachers know it. Many of them do not. Sit them down and say there was a night in South Carolina when black students were shot for standing up for their rights, and for decades, nobody talked about it. Say the names with them. Samuel Hammond, Henry Smith, Delano Middleton. Teach them that their people have faced this level of violence and are still here. Share this with people of every background. Everybody needs to know the truth if we are ever going to build something better. Truth does not belong to one race. Truth belongs to anyone willing to face it. You are now a keeper of this story. That is not a small thing. That is a responsibility. When lies show up, you have something to counter them. When someone says that stuff does not really happen, you can say, "Let me tell you about Orangeburg." In a moment, we are going to pray. Because as much as this is about history and politics, it is also about your soul. It is about how you carry what you have learned. It is about how you move forward without letting bitterness eat you alive, but also without letting fake peace lull you back to sleep. Before we pray, let this settle in your spirit. The same God who saw your ancestors in the belly of slave ships saw those students on that campus field. The same God who heard the cries of mothers when their sons were lynched, heard the cries of mothers when their sons were shot in Orangeburg. The same God who carried your family through centuries of oppression is carrying you now. You are not alone in this. So wherever you are right now, if it is safe to do so, you can bow your head, or just quiet your mind. Let us talk to the one who has been with you and your people from the very beginning. Father God, we come to you with hearts that are heavy, but not broken. We come to you with minds that are clearer than they were before, and with spirits that are hungry for justice and healing. We thank you for the lives of Samuel Hammond, Henry Smith, and Delano Middleton. Young men who should have grown old, who should have had families, who should have lived to see a different day. We thank you that their story has not been completely erased, that their names are still spoken, that their blood still cries out for justice. We lift up their families, known and unknown, who carried grief and anger through years of silence. We ask you to comfort them, even now, generations later. Let them feel that their sons and brothers are not forgotten. Let them see signs in this life or the next that the truth is finally being told. We pray for every survivor who walked away from that field with pellets in their bodies and trauma in their minds. You know their names. You know their scars. You know the nights they could not sleep. Touch them with your healing, even after all these years. Remind them that what they went through was not for nothing. We pray for Cleveland Sellers and for every organizer who has been punished for standing up for what is right. Strengthen those who continue that work today. Protect them from lies, from traps, from discouragement. Let them know that you see what they are doing. We ask you to deal with systems that kill and call it law, systems that lie and call it order, systems that erase and call it education. Pull back every layer of deception. Expose what needs to be exposed. Bring to account what needs to be judged. We ask you for real justice, not just in the next life, but in this one. We ask you to move the hearts of leaders who have the power to open investigations, release records, and make repair. We ask you to open doors for reparations where they have been slammed shut. We ask you to stir up a holy dissatisfaction in anyone who has grown comfortable with an unjust peace. We ask you to bless every person listening right now. You know their stories. You know the times they have been stopped by police and felt fear rise in their throats. You know the jobs they were passed over for. You know the insults they swallowed. You know the tears they have cried in secret. Strengthen them. Remind them who they are. Not victims, survivors, descendants of fighters, children of the Most High. Let them feel deep in their bones that their lives matter to you, that their history matters to you, that their struggle is seen. Give them courage to speak truth in love. Give them wisdom to know when to rest and when to fight. Give them unity with others who care about justice across lines of race, age, and background. Let them find community that lifts them up, not tears them down. Most of all, remind them that your truth does not change. No matter how many lies are told, no matter how many books are edited, no matter how many records are sealed, your eyes have seen all of it. Your judgment is perfect. Your mercy is real. We release our anger into your hands, not so that it disappears, but so that it does not consume us. We ask you to turn that anger into energy, energy to build, to teach, to organize, to love fiercely, to protect the innocent, to honor the dead. We thank you that you did not let our people be wiped out. We thank you that we are still here, still standing, still praising, still fighting, still remembering. And we ask you to walk with us from this moment on as we carry the story of Orangeburg and so many other stories that were hidden. Let this not be just another sad thing we heard. Let it be a turning point. In the name of Jesus, who was himself executed by the state, who knows what it is to be innocent and condemned, who rose anyway, we pray. Amen. Listen, you have walked through darkness in this story, but you are not meant to stay there. Walk in truth, walk in courage, walk in love, demand justice, build wealth. Tell the stories they tried to erase. A freshman named Samuel Hammond stood with his friends, only 18 years old. A sophomore named Henry Smith, also 18, stood nearby, mind full of exams, big dreams, and the future he believed he could build. A high school senior named Delano Middleton, just 17, not even a college student, had stopped by after basketball practice. He came to the campus the way kids do, curious, wanting to see what was going on. He did not know he was walking into the last night of his life. The clock crept toward 10:33 at night. The students had been out there for hours.